Hi, we return to Genesis 34 today for the shocking conclusion of this drama that we've been looking at. I trust you're familiar with the story, but if not, what a shock it comes after an agreement has been made, apparently between both sides, to exchange wives and land as long as the Shechemites are circumcised, and yet. So before we get into our scene, just a couple things to set the context. As we've been doing throughout this unit, we've been looking through the Jacob cycle, and we're here almost at the end of it. And we've been looking at some of these issues and interpreting this section here. We're almost at the end here, and really we're on the last one, the closing exchange between Jacob and Levi and Simeon, and whose side are we quote-unquote supposed to take. But I'll qualify that air quotes there in a second. They're not air quotes on the page, I guess, but they are in my voice. And one of the things we've been looking at is how it's shaped in this sequence of chiasms, and this section today is outside the chiasm, even though this part in 35:1-7 forms a nice tight chiasm, as you can see with the make an altar and built an altar, etc. Here, this is not. Even though there are some echoes, the capture and plundered here has to do with capturing and plundering, but it doesn't form a chiastic shape. Perhaps to suggest the chaotic nature of what happens here. After these orderly accounts of an exchange between fathers and sons on both sides, what seemed like an agreement between Hamor and Shechem and the people of the city and Jacob's people, we have this terrible scene here. So elements we need to look at, as we've been looking at, are ways in which the story echoes other parts of Genesis. We've been seeing throughout how chapter 34, you can see all the way back to the top if you haven't been following these videos, echoes earlier parts all the way through Genesis. And one of the elements of that is, as we come to the end of the Jacob cycle, we're also coming to the end of the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and of course Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel cycle that began in chapter 12. And so we're seeing many echoes all the way through this chapter from back there, and only often in places where there's only one other use of the word or the image that we see in our chapter here. So where we are now is down to here about the sword, and we see Esau would live by the sword, and only the sword that's turning to guard the Garden of Eden, and the sword around what Laban suggests he could have taken them by the sword is the only other sword. And then we see here the taking away of captives and rescuing them as Abraham did. He was actually Abram in that moment. The word for captured here, shavu, is only two other times for when Abram heard that Lot had been taken captive, and when Laban told to Jacob, that suggests that Jacob had taken Laban's daughters captive. So we see those comparable situations. We'll see in Jacob's response that Levi and Simeon's actions has made his name stink to the settlers, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and we saw only one other time do we see Canaanites and Perizzites when Abraham, at that time Abram and Lot separated, and Abram told Lot to take the land that looked good before him, and we saw what happened there. Lot ended up in Sodom. We see the challenge that Jacob makes if they gather against me, and the word for gathered that you can see there, not pronounceable at the vowels, echoes when the flocks were gathered 4 times in chapter 29 when Jacob was there to wait for the flocks to be gathered there around the Rachel courtship scene, so at the beginning and the end there of that story. And then the threat that they might attack him as the kings came and subdued, described there as it subdued instead of attacked the Rephaim there. So a number of ways in that echoes. But there are also echoes with the other similar stories, including the rape stories. Many point out that both end with the brother of the victim killing her attacker that we see there. But there are also many differences, as we've noted down here. There are also very similar parallels to the issue of David and Bathsheba, not only now in what we see here around the flip side of this, where Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, as we'll see in a moment, kill Shechem and his people to prevent the marriage. And the opposite happens here. David has Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed to allow for his marriage to her there. And we'll also see the parallel with the name stinking, with Absalom's name stinking as a result in 2 Samuel 16:21. But we're also going to see how this sets up a whole series of parallel troubles, and that will start with Rachel dying in childbirth that we'll see in the next chapter. So let's put our key words up here, and we'll begin to look at our story, knowing we're going to look at a couple of other elements of this elsewhere in Genesis as we go. So the first thing I want to note on the left side of the screen is how quickly this happens. So we can see on the top, the end of verse 24, when they listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city, and then with no break, on the third day, when they were still in pain, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the cities unaware and killed all the males. One sentence, one verse, and they've destroyed all the males who were just circumcised. We obviously have to look back at that in some detail to see what's going on here. So first, on the third day, one of the questions people might ask in the modern world is, what is the effect of circumcision on an adult? And even this little suggestion with modern technology and modern ways to circumcise as well as healing says, as you can see, that for a couple of weeks it's going to be a bit of a challenge for the men there. So we can expect that on the third day in the ancient world they would not be moving much, and of course that's exactly the problem for them, as the narrator underscores that while they were still in pain, using this word ka'avim here, only here in Genesis, and it's in a psalm and a couple other places, but none connected to here. But let's look back at the interesting issue of the third day. If you're a Christian, you of course might associate the third day with the resurrection of Jesus, which this is not a resurrection story. But if we look at the examples of the third day in Genesis, they are all life and death stories where life and death are the issue. And perhaps in the audience, in the minds of the evangelists, for their audience, there might well be a distant echo of this third day, but it's hard to say. So we saw back in chapter 22, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place where he was to sacrifice Isaac far away. And of course, as we know, he didn't end up sacrificing Isaac, which will come up in another chart I'll show you in just a minute about violence in the book of Genesis. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled and pursued him with violent intent. And when he got there, as the example I already was noting, why have you taken my daughters as if they were captives? And I could have treated you with violence, but it doesn't happen there. In our situation we have here. Later in chapter 40, on the third day, which is Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker, and then literally lifted up the head of the chief baker by hanging him. So there was a life and death issue there too. And then finally in 42:18, on the third day, Joseph said to his brothers, whom he had imprisoned, "Do what he says and you will live, for I fear God," when they feared that their lives were on the line. So all the third days in Genesis have to do with life and death situations, including this one here for alert listeners. I did not put that in the links to Genesis 34 to earlier passages, but I just made it in the other chart as you just saw. So this is the first time we hear about Simeon and Levi. We've heard about the sons of Jacob as a group, and you can see that throughout here where we see sons of Jacob a number of times. You can see those for yourself here in these colors right here, for example. But now we hear Simeon and Levi. As Brisman notes below, Simeon is a tribe whose land allotment is enclaves within Judah. Likewise with Levi indicates a punishment rather than a special moment, which is a special merit, which is to say not an extensive territory that has its own name. There's no region of Simeon or Levi. Levi in the distribution according to Leviticus, because they're the priests and temple servants, get other people to provide for them, but they don't get any land. As Sternberg notes below, their names remind readers of the estrangement between Jacob and their mother Leah, and aid in the understanding of their motivation in the face of the father's silence and inaction, as I've noted before. And interestingly, in the apocryphal, not apocryphal, but not Hebrew Bible text of Judith, which is why my Bible program doesn't highlight it there because it's not in the New Revised Standard, we hear this recollection of it. O Lord God of my father Simeon, to whom thou gavest a sword to take revenge on the strangers who had loosed the girdle of a virgin to defile her, and uncovered her thigh to put her to shame, and polluted her womb to disgrace her, for thou hast said it shall not be done, and yet they did it. And so we see that down below. And that's about Simeon. And then about Levi, Brisman again notes, Jacob, the writer, this is from the perspective that sees this as an E text, an Elohist text, because as we'll see in chapter 35, Yahweh is not mentioned and El is mentioned. So this is seeing this as a northern Israelite source, but that's something we haven't been following in my reading of this. But let's hear what he has to say from that perspective. He says, Jacob the writer attacks the entire priestly establishment of Isaac religion, which is to say the E version. The Levites have no portion in the land of Israel, not because they are holier, but because they are more brutal than the rest. So his point there is that this is a story to say why the Levites don't get the land. Not because they're, as I was just mentioning, given a priestly allotment, but because they don't deserve it, because they're so violent. And we can compare the story of Phinehas, this specifically named Levite, leading a violence against the Midianites in Numbers 31. We won't look at that now. You can find that on your own. So we know Simeon and Levi named as Dinah's brothers, as Absalom will be named as Tamar's brother, sons of Leah, as we noted, took their swords. And notice how the taking, repeated in 25, 26, and 28, is also the key word that goes back to what kings do, or what people like Shechem do. Take for me this girl, which he'd already done. He already took her, as we saw there appear. And so now the taking comes the other direction. They took their swords. We haven't known they had swords. As I was noting before, there were not other swords mentioned other than Esau's sword. This is the first use of a sword by humans in all of Genesis, and we'll compare that to other violence in just a moment. And they came against what's a difficult to translate phrase here, against a city unawares. Now, the word for unawares, betach, means securely, but it's only here in Genesis. It's 43 times in the Hebrew Scripture, and the next use in terms of the sequence from Genesis through the Bible is in the Jubilee context in Leviticus 25 and 26. Look at one example here from 25, 28. So you may live on the land securely and live on it securely. So in that sense, it's against the secure city, as a number of commentators have noted. And the city thought it was secure, but the circumcision made it insecure, and killed all the males. And as we noted in the previous video, those who were killed are not all the males. It's all the males who gathered at the gate of the city, which would be all the military eligible age males, which helps us to underscore why they were able to do it, because there's no defense here. And we recognize this is a rare moment for killing in Genesis. The Hebrew Bible is full of lots of killing, and in the parallel and perhaps opposite monarchy story, especially 1st and 2nd Samuel, we hear things repeated like Saul is killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands, celebrated by the women in the street as signs of heroism. But Genesis isn't like that. Let's look briefly at violent death in Genesis. And as you can see here, the blue parts are human-caused death, and the purple parts are God-caused death. And so plainly at the beginning, it's Cain, the first murderer who's turned away from God and builds a city. So murder associated with the city in chapter 4, and we see that here. And then his 7th generation descendant, Lamech, celebrates his having killed a man for wounding me. And so those are plainly negative. That whole lineage goes out in the flood. But then, of course, there's the flood, where Yahweh engages in more killing than Cain or Lamech had ever done, blotted out every living thing. What do we think of that? Then we get to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and here the kings in Sodom and Gomorrah fell into some of the pits, so this isn't divinely caused exactly. It's not quite human caused, it's more earth caused, but it's certainly caused by the people engaging in the kind of violence they were in chapter 14. Notice this is not the destruction of Sodom in 19, this is during the war, so this is human caused in the sense there's a human war. But this one certainly is Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, the classic fire and sulfur. Then we get to our scene here. There are also an interesting number of near-death situations where death was in the air but didn't happen. 3 times in the wife-sister stories that we can see in 12, 20, and 26 here, where there's the concern that the people of empire will kill a woman or kill a man to get their woman. So Abraham about Sarai here, and here Yahweh saying to him here, do not lay your hand on the I'm sorry, not that one, this one here. God came to Abimelech in the dream, you were about to die because of the woman. And then this one with Isaac here, expressing the same thing as his father. This one, of course, is God protecting Isaac from being killed by Abraham. And then finally, the brothers conspire to kill Joseph, but Reuben saves his life, and then they trick poor dad by taking the blood of a goat and putting it on the coat, so-called coat of many colors, really just a long-sleeve tunic, and sending it back to Jacob, who thinks his son has been killed. So the only human violence that we've seen that's not divine violence is Cain and the war in chapter 14, which you've seen is parallel with Abram rescuing Lot, this scene here, and then the near-death experience. So this is really the only scene in all of Genesis where there's a warlike killing. And as I was noting in the last video, we should have been there was a hint that that was coming when we saw at the end of chapter 38, the frame that holds us all together, that Jacob had pitched his tent in the face of the city. And so that was already an element of suggesting there was warfare coming, because as we noted, that phrase is used for when the Israelites in Numbers or in Joshua pitch their tents on the edge of a city and prepare to lay it siege or to attack it otherwise. And so that this violence really stands out. And as Sternberg and others, his scholarly feud with Gun and Fuel, who write against him and he writes back against them, and other people write against them about how to read this chapter, and I'm saving you the trouble of looking at all that. Sternberg spent a lot of time asking the question of, does the violence of the brothers here balance or not balance the rape? But as I've been trying to suggest throughout this video, of course it doesn't. And of course that's not really the question. Because as we'll see at the end, there is no good answer. The question that the brothers put to Jacob relating the issue of Dinah's honor versus Jacob's reputation after this is highlighting the problem was Jacob should not have settled near the city in the first place, but it should have listened to God, as we'll see God say it. You can see on the right side of the screen in chapter 35, the first thing that happens is arise, go to Bethel and settle there. So that's the problem. And the attempt by modern readers to try to see, does the violence here balance the rape, is to miss the real question. So notice it said they killed all the males, and then it's specified they killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword. That's not more killing, that's just specifying that in the midst of it. And then we get the surprise twist that I've been hinting at, that I've spoilered, if you will, but here it is. They took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. And as my note below has, using use of take here, lakak, the word for take, both for the taking of her in the first place and the other takings we've just seen, making clear that Shechem's taking of Dinah did not itself express rape, only now is this made explicit. As Sternberg notes, wisely the narrator decided against playing this trump card as long as the reader sided with the brothers anyway. Instead, having it kept up his sleeve since verse 5, he now throws it on the scales of judgment at the critical moment. But is it that? And that's the point I was just making. And they took it and went away, which is a bad translation here, because it's exactly the same verse for coming out, which is to highlight the people that Hamor and Shechem went to were the warriors and who went out of the gate of the city, and that's exactly what they're doing now. So it's that Simeon and Levi with the sword end up being the very warriors that the people at the gate were supposed to be. And now after that, everybody jumps in on the spoil. And we should see this, I think, as an ugly scene. These other sons who've been quiet the whole time, now that it's safe, go grab all the plunder. It looks simply greedy, doesn't it? Or can you see in your own mind some kind of justification for what's happening here? After all the other people in town were innocent, and it will get even worse as the narrator makes clear the weight of what they've done. So as my note here, the other sons, the translation is, as Sternberg notes, other is not necessarily implied. It's just the sons of Jacob. But it makes much of the contrast between the supposed purity of motive of Simeon and Levi in doing what is necessary to save their sister and the others who leap upon this justification and act like hyenas on the slaughter. And they come upon the slain here, a word, hakalaim here, only here in Genesis, but it's normally rendered as defiled or rendered unclean as in Leviticus or in Numbers. So if we render it that way, they leapt upon the defiled, which is exactly what Dinah was seen as we see in all the red underlined elements here. So they're defiled, although it's a different word than we saw for Dinah. And they plundered the city. As Westerman suggests, the real motive for the violation, but we can question that. Was the goal really plunder, or was the goal vengeance against Hamor and Shechem alone, but they killed everybody else while they were at it? Highlighting here, the reason was because their sister had been defiled. But is that so? Are they plundering the city because their sister has been defiled? Is this their motivation, or is this the narrator just saying that? It's hard to know because they're silent here. But the description of their plunder is put in detail that could make even the most pro-Israelite partisan perhaps a little nervous. We see here. And my note below has what happens in verse 20. It's exactly what Hamor and Shechem promised to the men at the gate in the other direction. As you can see on the right side of the screen, will not their livestock, their property, and all their animals be ours? Offering a promise that was not made, but now it comes the other way around. The sons of Jacob took their flocks and their herds and their donkeys. Let's look a little more closely closely at that, the there, appears 8 times in these 2 verses. You can see there, there. Their flocks and their herds, but their donkeys, which is their Hamorim, the Hamorim. As I noted earlier, Hamor means donkey, especially in the book of Esther, where the evil king is King Hamor as a donkey. And so they took their Hamors, and that's got to be a joke that they were in on there. And whatever was in the city and in the field. So they took everything out there, but now the narrator really underscores this, and we'll look at the Numbers verse in a minute after we look at this. All their wealth, all their little ones, all their wives, all that was in the houses, they captured and made their prey. The triple all here matches the triple all here. It's covered over a little bit by the every male, but all who went out of the city gate, all the males, all out of the city gate, and here all their wealth, all their little ones, and all that was in their houses. But their little ones ought to make us wonder. This is the children. Notice it's not calling them children. It's calling them just little ones, really underscoring their vulnerability and innocence. And their wives are literally women. As Turner notes, an ironic fulfillment. They were going to exchange wives, and now the Israelite sons get all the wives of the women of that family. Whether they married them or not isn't told. And all that was in their houses, they captured. As I noted, the word that we saw 2 other times, precisely what Laban accused Jacob of doing to his daughters, and made their prey, or literally plundered. It's the same word here as in 27. So we could see a little ABA chiasm here if we want, around the plundered and captured, and took that in the middle, but we don't have to. So that's the horrible description, and I don't know what reader might, if they weren't familiar with it, might want to pause and just wonder at the shock of the complete destruction of the town of Shechem. Whether that's meant behind the scenes to clarify that Shechem was no longer occupied by the Hivites, so it could become the place that Israelites controlled, and as I showed a couple times in this series, the way Shechem is used in the monarchy story is the place where both Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the rival successors after Solomon, gathered people to be made king or to make their city capital in the case of Jeroboam. But Genesis doesn't comment on that element. So after the dust settles, we have this closing scene. And let me scroll down so we can see the whole thing on our screen here, verses 30 and 31. So as Westerman notes below, and there are a couple of views on this, he sees the contrast between Jacob's view and Simeon and Levi's view as the opposing positions of, quote, 2 epochs are presented: the caution and concern of nomadic families outnumbered by others, and an honor-shame culture for whom blood vengeance doesn't count the cost. But Sternberg suggests another way to look at it. The voice of egocentricity and self-preservation finds itself opposed by the voice of idealism. And my own note below notes that this is the first time Jacob's speaking here, and his speech reveals at the end his reason for the silence. So he said here to Simeon and Levi, and he'll speak about them again in 49:7. Let's go to that now while I'm on this connected note here. So in 49:7, which is Jacob's deathbed blessings or curses for all his sons, and this is a scroll up and you can see here, is about Simeon and Levi. May I never come into their counsel, may I not be joined for their company, for in their anger they killed men, at their whim they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That the perspective, at least from the author of Genesis 49, which when we get to the Joseph story, or more technically the story of Jacob's sons, starting in chapter 37, we'll consider its source from a much later period, a source question I haven't been looking at in Genesis 1 to 36, but we will look at there, since it's all one continuous story, except for Genesis 38, but we'll get there soon enough. So he says to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me, using the word har or hartem in this form. Very hard to translate. And you can see below a number of different versions that have been translated. One of them suggests bringing ruin. I'm not sure where the make taboo came from, but there's that one. Sarna suggests muddy the waters. Hepner suggests cause anguish. As Peterson notes, every time a har is used in the Deuteronomic history, it is in the context of a broken oath or covenant. There is no oath or covenant here, but it certainly would echo for that for the exilic or post-exilic audience reading Genesis. And also note here how self-centered Jacob is. Notice the me, my numbers are few. If they gather against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, I and my household. Wow. All about him. Notice not about us. He's talking to his own sons and his whole household, but it's all about him. Where has Jacob gone? Where is the Jacob who had his whole family and everything gone? That's all about him now. And that's my note below about the pronouns. Making me odious, that was covering over a nice image from the Hebrew, making my name stink. It's only here in Genesis, but as I note below has, it's in 2 Samuel, and it'll echo into the Absalom story also. Literally to the settlers of the land, not the inhabitants of the land, but the settlers. And that's the whole point all the way through. He shouldn't be settling among these people. And I already noted the parallel with the Canaanites and the Perizzites in 13:7, noted down below. My numbers are few, although we see that his numbers are not necessarily few. Notice how this is ironically an expression of Psalm 105 that we can see here. When they were few in number, of little account and strangers in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one king to another, he allowed no one to oppress them. So that's providing for God's protection when the Israelite numbers are few. But Jacob has no sense here that Yahweh or El will protect him, which is an interesting moment here, that he has no confidence in God's protection from him. And if they gather themselves against me, as the sheep were gathered at the well when he began his relationships with the Rachel household, and attack me, as we noted for the attack of the kings in chapter 14, I shall be destroyed. Again, just I, using a word only here in Genesis, perhaps ironically echoing Deuteronomy 7:4 and 29 times in Deuteronomy about destroying the Canaanites, or God will destroy you. And so here's Jacob expressing all his concern of what you've done is ruined me and my whole house, which of course includes them. And one could ask here, certainly this doesn't mean his literal house because he's in a tent, but house in the way we see like the house of David and the house of Israel as the wider body here. So household isn't a bad translation, other than that it's the same word bayit that we saw for the house from which they took Tamar from the house of Shechem. But they answer and leave this wonderfully rhetorical question laying open for readers and scholars to wonder about. But should our sister, notice not your daughter, as my note says, our sister, be treated here? I'm using Ya'asa, not the passive form as in here in the NSV translation, but should be made, or should he make, leaving open whether this is spoken to Jacob about Shechem or to each other about Jacob, whose unwillingness to refuse the offer would have resulted in selling his daughter. So is it Jacob who would otherwise be seen as treating his daughter like a whore by not caring for her, or is it Shechem doing it? And the word for a whore here, Zonah, the first use of it in Genesis, and we'll see one other use of it in the story that I just noted, breaks into the Joseph story in chapter 38, and we see it in Leviticus. But Bechtel notes a strong dissent here, and she says, by saying that Dinah has become like a harlot, the sons of Jacob show they do not regard Dinah as having been raped. Instead, they're pointing to the fact that she's become a marginal figure by engaging in sexual activity outside her society and without the possibility of bonding, since the sons are unwilling to give their sister to an uncircumcised outsider. And that's the perspective of Anita Diamond in the popular novel I referred to earlier, The Red Tent, which suggests that this was truly a love story, but Simeon and Levi's violence and jealousy turned it into the story that we see here. That's going beyond the text, and it's also going beyond the Midrash. But it's based on comments that echo with what Bechtel wrote years after The Red Tent had been written, to highlight that we had not seen her treated as a whore. She was not acting for pay at all. She was taken against her consent. So there's nothing like whoreness here, even though that would have certainly defiled her. And that question is just hanging, and there's no response from Jacob, and there's no intervention from the narrator. The next word is from God as we start a new chapter, and we'll see where that sends Jacob and his family next time. See you then. Bye-bye.